Imagine stepping into a country where your American passport isn't just a travel document, it's a target. From militant groups to hostile factions, there are places where U.S. citizens are actively pursued. Here are the 10 countries where Americans are not welcome in 2024, and why setting foot in them could be the most dangerous decision you ever make. In today's video, we are going to see some such countries. So in today's video, we are going to show you 10 countries where Americans are not welcome in 2024. But before starting the video, I want to request we put our best efforts to create our every single video. So please don't forget to like the video and subscribe. Number 10, North Korea. North Korea remains one of the most isolated and secretive nations in the world. And for Americans, it's not just difficult to visit, it's outright dangerous. The U.S. State Department has banned travel to North Korea for American citizens since 2017, following the tragic case of Otto Warmbier, a U.S. student who was imprisoned for allegedly stealing a propaganda poster. He later died after returning to the U.S. in a coma. For those who still attempt to defy the ban or travel through third-party routes, the risks are incredibly high. North Korea has no formal diplomatic relations with the U.S., and if you're detained, there's virtually no way to seek help from the U.S. government. Visitors are constantly monitored, and any minor infraction such as taking a photo in the wrong place or speaking critically of the regime can lead to severe consequences, including imprisonment in labor camps. Adding to this is North Korea's deep anti-American propaganda. The regime has built much of its internal messaging around portraying the U.S. as a primary enemy, which only heightens the dangers for American travelers. In this highly controlled environment, your every move is scrutinized, and your American identity may be seen as a threat. In 2024, North Korea remains a place where American citizens are not only unwelcome, but actively at risk. Number 9, Iran. Iran, once a cradle of ancient civilizations and a land of rich culture, has become a country where Americans are met with suspicion and caution. The complex relationship between the U.S. and Iran, marked by decades of political tensions, sanctions, and conflict, has significantly impacted how Americans are perceived and treated in the country. For U.S. citizens, traveling to Iran comes with serious risks. Since the 1979 Iranian Revolution and the U.S. Embassy hostage crisis, anti-American sentiment has been deeply ingrained in certain segments of Iranian society, especially within the government. Iran's government often portrays the U.S. as an adversary, using propaganda and rhetoric to frame America as the source of many of the nation's woes. This political climate makes it dangerous for Americans, particularly as the Iranian government has detained and imprisoned U.S. citizens on accusations of espionage or attempting to overthrow the regime. Americans who do travel to Iran, often on humanitarian or journalistic work, must be highly cautious. Even the most innocent actions, such as socializing with locals or taking photos in the wrong places, can be misinterpreted by authorities. Iran's Revolutionary Guard is known to closely monitor foreign visitors, especially those from the U.S., and what might seem like a harmless conversation can quickly escalate into accusations of espionage. Additionally, diplomatic relations between Iran and the U.S. are non-existent, meaning there is no U.S. embassy in Iran. If an American citizen gets into trouble, they have little to no consular support, making it difficult to navigate legal or political issues. While Iran's vibrant history and stunning landscapes may seem alluring, for Americans it remains a highly dangerous and unwelcoming destination in 2024. Number 8, Syria. Syria, once a hub of ancient civilizations and home to stunning landmarks, has become a war-torn and dangerous country where Americans are not just unwelcome, but at serious risk. Since the outbreak of the Syrian civil war in 2011, the country has descended into chaos, with numerous factions vying for control, including the Syrian government, rebel groups, and extremist organizations like ISIS. For U.S. citizens, Syria represents one of the most dangerous places on the planet. One of the primary reasons Syria is off-limits for Americans is the extreme instability and ongoing conflict. The U.S. government has imposed a do-not-travel advisory for Syria, largely due to the high risk of kidnapping, terrorism, and violence. Numerous American citizens, including journalists and humanitarian workers, have been abducted and even killed by extremist groups operating within Syria, some of whom specifically target Westerners for ransom or political leverage. Syria's government, led by Bashar al-Assad, has also had a long history of hostility toward the United States, particularly in light of U.S. involvement in the conflict and support for rebel factions. The country has been heavily influenced by anti-Western and specifically anti-American rhetoric. Americans who somehow enter Syria may find themselves in danger not only from extremist groups, but also from government forces and militias loyal to Assad, who may view any foreigner, especially an American, with extreme suspicion. The infrastructure in Syria has been devastated by years of war, making it nearly impossible to travel safely. There are no direct flights from the U.S. and no diplomatic services available to assist Americans in distress, as the U.S. Embassy in Damascus suspended operations in 2012. This leaves any American traveler stranded without help in a country torn apart by conflict. Number 7. Venezuela. Venezuela, once one of the wealthiest nations in Latin America, has faced a severe economic, political, and social collapse in recent years, making it a highly unwelcoming destination for Americans in 2024. The deep-rooted tensions between the Venezuelan government and the U.S. have created a volatile environment where Americans are often viewed with suspicion or outright hostility. One of the main reasons for the strained relationship is the long-standing political friction between the two nations. The U.S. government has imposed sanctions on Venezuela in response to human rights abuses, corruption, and the erosion of democracy under the leadership of Nicolas Maduro. In turn, the Venezuelan government frequently uses anti-American rhetoric to rally domestic support, blaming the U.S. for the country's economic crisis and political instability. This has fostered an atmosphere of resentment toward Americans among some segments of the population, particularly among pro-government groups. For Americans traveling to Venezuela, the risks are numerous. Venezuela has one of the highest crime rates in the world, with rampant kidnappings, robberies, and violent assaults, particularly targeting foreigners. Americans, due to their perceived wealth and connection to the U.S. government, are often seen as lucrative targets for kidnapping, whether for ransom or political leverage. Additionally, the country's infrastructure has collapsed, with widespread shortages of basic necessities such as food, water, and medical supplies. The healthcare system is in disarray, and access to emergency services is limited, creating a highly unsafe environment for visitors. The U.S. State Department has issued a do not travel advisory for Venezuela, warning Americans of the severe dangers including civil unrest, arbitrary detention, and the lack of adequate security. Further compounding the situation is the absence of diplomatic relations. The U.S. Embassy in Venezuela was closed in 2019, leaving American citizens without any formal consular services or legal protections in the event of an emergency. Number 6. Russia. In 2024, Russia stands as one of the most unwelcoming countries for Americans, largely due to the heightened political tensions between the two nations. The ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine, coupled with the West's sanctions against Russia, has deepened the divide, making the situation particularly precarious for American travelers. The relationship between the U.S. and Russia has always been strained, but the war in Ukraine and the U.S. support for Ukraine has escalated anti-American sentiment within Russia. The Russian government has intensified its nationalist rhetoric, framing the United States as one of its primary adversaries. This narrative is amplified by Russian state media, which often portrays Americans as hostile foreign agents or provocateurs. Consequently, traveling to Russia with a U.S. passport can invite increased scrutiny, suspicion, and even hostility from government officials, law enforcement, and ordinary citizens. Americans visiting Russia may also face arbitrary detentions, particularly in the context of the current political climate. There have been recent cases of American citizens being arrested and charged with espionage, sometimes on flimsy or politically motivated grounds. These arrests often lead to prolonged detentions, with little access to legal assistance or diplomatic support due to the fractured relations between the two countries. Moreover, the U.S. Embassy in Russia operates at a significantly reduced capacity, limiting the ability to provide consular services or assist American citizens in distress. This makes it much more difficult for travelers to navigate legal or emergency situations. In addition to legal and political risks, the social environment has become increasingly hostile. Anti-American sentiment is widespread, especially in pro-government circles. Travelers could face discrimination, harassment, or worse, particularly in rural areas or among nationalist groups that see Americans as representatives of a hostile foreign power. Number 5. Afghanistan. Afghanistan, a nation defined by decades of conflict, has become one of the most dangerous and unwelcoming places for Americans in 2024. Following the withdrawal of U.S. forces in 2021 and the return of the Taliban to power, the country has descended into a complex and unstable environment with significant risks for American travelers. One of the key reasons Americans are not welcome in Afghanistan is the deep resentment harbored by the Taliban and other militant groups toward the United States. After 20 years of U.S. military presence, the Taliban's victory was framed as a defeat of foreign intervention, with the U.S. being cast as an occupying force. This historical context fuels anti-American sentiment, especially among Taliban leaders, insurgents, and some sections of the population. For Americans who attempt to enter Afghanistan, this hostility can manifest in the form of harassment, detainment, or even physical harm. The Taliban's rule has also drastically affected the security landscape in the country. Extremist groups like ISIS-K continue to operate in parts of Afghanistan, targeting Westerners, including Americans, for kidnappings, attacks, or retaliation. These groups often see Americans as high-value targets for ransom or political leverage. Any foreigner, particularly an American, risks being abducted by militant groups for propaganda purposes or financial gain. Moreover, the current regime in Afghanistan has little tolerance for Western ideologies or cultural influences. American travelers could face punishment for actions that violate the Taliban's strict interpretation of Islamic law, such as dress code violations, unapproved interactions with locals, or carrying Western media. The Taliban's justice system operates outside the norms of international law, and foreigners have very limited access to legal protection or a fair trial. Even minor infractions can result in harsh penalties, including imprisonment. Diplomatic support for Americans in Afghanistan is also virtually non-existent. The U.S. Embassy in Kabul suspended its operations in 2021, and the U.S. government has no formal diplomatic presence in the country. This lack of consular services means that American citizens in Afghanistan are entirely on their own if they encounter legal issues, health crises, or security threats. Number 4. Yemen. Yemen, a country ravaged by civil war, humanitarian crises, and widespread instability, remains one of the most dangerous and unwelcoming places for Americans in 2024. The ongoing conflict involving multiple factions, including the Houthi rebels, the Saudi-led coalition, and various militant groups, has turned the country into a chaotic battleground where foreigners, especially Americans, face extreme risks. One of the primary reasons Yemen is unwelcoming for Americans is the hostile attitude toward the United States among several of the warring factions, particularly the Iranian-backed Houthi rebels, who control large portions of the country. The Houthis view the U.S. as a key supporter of the Saudi-led coalition, which has been involved in the conflict since 2015. This has fostered significant anti-American sentiment, and Americans are often seen as symbols of foreign interference. The risk of being detained or targeted by Houthi forces or other militant groups is extremely high. The ongoing civil war has also led to the rise of extremist groups like Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, also known as AQAP, and ISIS, both of which operate within Yemen and actively target Westerners, including Americans. These groups have a long history of kidnapping foreigners for ransom or to make political statements. Any American in Yemen would be a high-profile target for these terrorist organizations, who may use abductions as propaganda tools or for financial gain. In addition to the threat of violence, Yemen's infrastructure has been decimated by years of war. The healthcare system is in a state of collapse, with widespread shortages of food, clean water, and medical supplies. Traveling through the country is perilous, as roadways and airports are frequently targeted by airstrikes, while entire regions are cut off due to conflict. The lack of basic services makes it nearly impossible to travel safely, let alone handle any emergencies. The U.S. State Department has issued a strict "do not travel" advisory for Yemen, warning that the risk of terrorism, armed conflict, kidnapping, and civil unrest is exceptionally high. Complicating matters further, the U.S. Embassy in Yemen suspended operations in 2015, leaving American citizens with no diplomatic or consular support. This lack of formal representation means that Americans who enter Yemen are effectively on their own if they face legal, medical, or security issues. Number 3. Cuba. Cuba, while geographically close to the United States, remains a complex and often unwelcoming destination for Americans in 2024 due to decades of political tension and restrictive travel policies. Despite some brief moments of thawing relations, particularly during the Obama administration, Cuba and the U.S. continue to have a strained diplomatic relationship, which significantly impacts the experience of American travelers. The core of the tension lies in the long-standing U.S. embargo against Cuba, which has been in place since the 1960s. The embargo, intended to isolate Cuba's communist government, has severely limited economic and diplomatic relations between the two nations. In Cuba, the embargo is often portrayed as the primary cause of the island's economic hardships, fostering a level of resentment toward the U.S., while ordinary Cuban citizens are often welcoming and friendly to foreigners, including Americans. The government and some sectors of society continue to view the U.S. with suspicion and hostility. For American travelers, the U.S. government has implemented strict regulations on travel to Cuba, making it more complicated than traveling to most other countries. Americans are generally not allowed to visit Cuba for pure tourism purposes and must fall into specific categories, such as family visits, educational or religious activities, or humanitarian projects. These restrictions are part of the broader U.S. embargo and aim to limit Americans' engagement with Cuba's economy, especially its state-run tourism sector. In Cuba, Americans may also face a highly controlled environment. The Cuban government has a long history of monitoring foreign visitors, and Americans in particular may be subject to surveillance or scrutiny from authorities. Travelers should be cautious about discussing politics or engaging in activities that could be viewed as critical of the Cuban government. Cuban authorities have been known to detain individuals, including foreigners, for actions deemed to be subversive or politically sensitive. Number 2. Libya. Libya, once known for its Mediterranean coastline and rich history, has become one of the most dangerous and unwelcoming countries for Americans in 2024. Since the fall of Muammar Gaddafi in 2011, Libya has been engulfed in chaos, marked by a power struggle between rival factions, warlords, and militant groups. The ongoing instability, coupled with deep-seated anti-American sentiment among some groups, makes it an extremely risky destination for U.S. citizens. One of the key reasons for Libya's hostility toward Americans is the prolonged civil war and the role the U.S. played in Gaddafi's overthrow. NATO's intervention, which was strongly supported by the U.S., left a power vacuum that has never been fully resolved. This history has fueled resentment among certain factions and extremist groups, many of whom blame the U.S. for the country's current instability. As a result, Americans in Libya are viewed with suspicion and often seen as symbols of foreign intervention. Libya's security situation is particularly perilous for foreign travelers, including Americans. Various armed militias control different parts of the country, often engaging in violent clashes with one another. Some of these militias are involved in kidnapping foreigners, either for ransom or to make political statements. Americans are considered high-value targets and are at significant risk of abduction by both extremist groups, such as ISIS or Al-Qaeda affiliates, and criminal gangs operating in the country. In addition to the kidnapping threat, Libya's infrastructure has been decimated by years of conflict. The healthcare system is barely functional, access to clean water and electricity is inconsistent, and road travel is extremely dangerous due to ongoing fighting and the presence of landmines. Public services, including emergency response systems, are virtually non-existent in large parts of the country, making it difficult for anyone, especially foreigners, to receive help in the event of an emergency. The U.S. government has issued a strict do not travel advisory for Libya, warning Americans of the extreme risks of terrorism, civil unrest, and arbitrary detention. Furthermore, the U.S. Embassy in Tripoli has been closed since 2014 due to security concerns, meaning there are no consular services or diplomatic support available for U.S. citizens in the country. This lack of diplomatic presence leaves Americans completely vulnerable in the event of an arrest, injury, or any other crisis. Number 1. Somalia. Somalia, a country that has been in a state of near-continuous conflict since the early 1990s, is one of the most dangerous and unwelcoming places for Americans in 2024. With its fragile political landscape, ongoing civil strife, and the presence of terrorist groups like Al-Shabaab, Somalia presents extreme risks for foreign travelers, especially those from the United States. One of the primary reasons Somalia is inhospitable to Americans is the dominance of militant Islamist group Al-Shabaab, which controls large swaths of the country. Al-Shabaab, affiliated with Al-Qaeda, is openly hostile toward Westerners, particularly Americans, due to the U.S. military's involvement in counter-terrorism operations in the region. The U.S. has carried out airstrikes and supported Somali government forces in their fight against Al-Shabaab, leading the group to frequently target Americans for kidnapping, ransom, or political killings. Kidnapping is a severe threat in Somalia, as Al-Shabaab and other criminal groups often seek to abduct foreigners for ransom. Americans, due to their nationality and perceived wealth, are considered high-value targets. Hostages are sometimes held for years, and negotiations for their release are fraught with uncertainty and danger. Even those who venture into Somalia for humanitarian or journalistic purposes have fallen victim to these threats. Beyond the risk of kidnapping, general lawlessness in much of the country makes Somalia highly dangerous for American travelers. The central government controls only a small portion of the capital, Mogadishu, while the rest of the country is ruled by warlords, militias, and extremist groups. These factions frequently engage in violent clashes, and the security situation can change rapidly, with little to no warning. Americans traveling to Somalia would be at risk of becoming caught in crossfire or attacked by rogue armed groups. Another factor contributing to the danger is the complete collapse of Somalia's infrastructure. The healthcare system is almost non-existent in many areas, and there is little access to emergency services. Should an American traveler face a medical or security crisis, it is unlikely they would receive timely or adequate help. Transportation, communication, and other essential services are severely limited, making it difficult to navigate the country or escape dangerous situations.